Hello. This week is the week that we're talking about rights of women and prevalent health challenges for women. Today is actually International Women's Day. Well, it will be while I'm recording this, not when you're actually watching it, but happy International Women's Day. It's an important sort of day that is grounded in socialist movements to talk about women and labor and solidarity. So it's totally my jam. So just wanted to bring that up. This week, I posed a question in your reading response of, does empowerment exist? That seems maybe like a strange question, but I spent a lot of time in grad school arguing with several of my professors who said, no, empowerment doesn't exist. Empowerment is not a thing that you can do. People can be given things and objects, and they can be given opportunities, but to empower oneself is not actually something that you can do, and so therefore it does not exist. I disagreed with that, but they had some very good points, and we had some very spirited sort of debates. So in this sort of lecture is centered around this idea of what is empowerment? Is it something that you can give? Is it something that you have to intrinsically have within yourself? What are the conditions and the other sort of things that are around that can make empowerment harder or maybe even impossible? So this week we'll start out just talking about what is empowerment. Well, there's lots of different definitions of it, but I like to use the one from the World Bank, not because I like the World Bank, but because the World Bank sets a lot of standards for what it means in sort of the development world to talk about ideas and pictures and these sort of things. And so the World Bank does a lot of empowerment work and talks about how do we empower specifically women, but also other sort of populations to take charge of their financial health. How do they help to create healthy financial stability in sort of the countries and ultimately for the world. And so according to the World Bank, empowerment is the process of enhancing the capacity of individuals. So that capacity of individuals, say that is where the empowering sort of part comes. They say it can also apply to groups to make choices and transform those choices into desired actions and outcomes. Central to the process of these actions are things that build individual and collective assets and improve the efficiency and fairness of the organizational and institutional context in which govern the use of these assets. Okay, so basically empowerment says, hey, we have to have opportunities, we have to have these sort of things that people can take an advantage of and be able to build upon, and then that is what creates empowered people, which can create an empowered society. We know that the World Bank particularly looks for women in these sort of situations because we know that women are much more likely to reinvest in the economy. That's just a statement of fact. It's not something that's political. It's not because I'm a feminist. It just happens to be true. If we look at sort of economic research over and over and over again, what we find is that women tend to reinvest money that they get into their families, which grows communities, which grows sort of nations. And so we know that putting money in women's hands actually is really, really powerful. If we put it in men's hands, sorry, not sorry, but oftentimes men spend it on themselves or in other sort of ways that go to reinvest in themselves, but not necessarily in the wider community. And so this is when you might have heard of things such as microloans. Microloans have been a very big thing. They won part of the Nobel Prize a couple years ago because of the way that they did microloan lending programs to women, and women were able to start family-run businesses and other sort of things. And we really were able to see a lot of families raise themselves out of poverty because of these microloans to women. So the World Bank says, empowerment doesn't just happen, that there's 4 areas that they really focus on about how we try to get empowerment to happen, right? Again, whether or not empowerment happens from within or from external is a debatable sort of thing, but they say, there's 4 areas we really have to look at in order to think about empowerment and how we do this in terms of practice. This is what they call their empowerment framework. They say the first sort of qualifier that you need for people to be empowered is to have access to information. You have to be able to have access to information. If you don't have full information, there's no way that you can adequately transform sort of your lives or your communities with any of this sort of stuff. Inclusion and participation is the second sort of area of practice. People have to be included and have to participate. The World Bank is very much a proponent of democracy, so not totally surprising of sort of this participatory governance and these sort of things, and people need to be included. Again, showing that yes, we need to have women included in all branches of the government for these sort of things. Accountability, so the fact that people need to be able to account things to be happening. We saw some lack of accountability happening when we've been talking about corruption and other sort of things. If you have a general distrust of things working out as fair or in your favor, then you're not going to trust that those sort of things will continue to carry on. And then we need to focus on local organizational capacity. So again, this sort of idea that we've talked about, that yes, sometimes big intranational sort of governmental organizations or supranational organizations are really important, but really what we need to look at when we're looking at sort of community development and community power is local organizational capacity, right? Who is there on the ground? Are the people empowered? Do they have information? Are they able to be accountable? Can they account on other sort of parts of systems to be accountable? So what I'm going to talk about now are three different pillars. The first three, we've talked a lot about the fourth one, the capacity of individuals, but the other three we're going to talk about a little bit today. So the first one is access to information. So for this one, I like to talk a little bit about some information about women and pregnancy in the Gambia. I have done a lot of work and lived in the Gambia many times in my life, and for some reason my slides aren't working. Hold on, I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. Computer froze. Don't know what happened. So as I was saying, I have lived in the Gambia several times in my life, and looking at sort of different aspects there. The Gambia is one of the poorest nations in the world. It's a very small nation. It doesn't have a lot of wealth. It was ruled by a dictator for a very long time. And so there are some issues there in terms of health and other sort of things. And so I worked with an organization in the Gambia that did a very large scale antenatal, which is what we call prenatal care across much of the international world. And so they did an antenatal care survey in the Gambia to say, what do we know about pregnant women? A lot of again, the information that we get from developing countries comes from prenatal, antenatal sort of clinics, because we get a lot of information from them. And so this survey was pretty big and it had a lot of information. And so some of the information you'll see in the slides is that 13% of recently pregnant people were teenagers. 15% of current pregnant women were teenagers. And teenagers would be up until the age of 20. And so that's a substantial sort of percentage. 67% of people who took part in the survey could neither read nor write. 60% had no education at all. 22% had attended at least secondary school. 25% were in their first pregnancy, 25% were in their fifth or higher pregnancy. Family size in the Gambia is pretty large. 74% of them had walked to the antenatal clinic. Having public transport and other sort of transportation options is not widely available in a lot of parts of the Gambia. And so a lot of women receive their care at local clinics, and they usually have to walk sometimes up to several miles to get to their prenatal sort of visits. And so in terms of who attended the birth of their child, we can see different sort of things. For the most part, they were state certified midwives, nurses, attendants, and other sort of limited trained clinical sort of capacity. A lot of people were community health nurses and midwives. Often those are vocational sort of apprentice type training. And very few were attended by nurses or doctors. 2% actually of births in the Gambia are attended by doctors, because there's very lack of available doctors. And the Gambia is a very poor country. So when they're looking at sort of this information, why do I bring up all these sort of statistics? When we talk about women and empowerment and we use stuff such as this, we've talked a lot about how women are at a disadvantage if they have babies earlier, if they have more children, they're not able to access education and all these sort of things. And so when we talk about access to information and being a vital part of empowerment, what does that look like in the developing world? If women are busy having babies because they're pressured to have that because it's part of sort of their societal norm, if they're not getting education, if they're doing all these other sort of things, and if their births are risky and they have to spend a lot of time thinking about sort of how am I going to have a healthy birth and all these sort of things, do these women have access to information? Are they able to be empowered in this sort of environment where their whole lives revolve around sort of this care and growth of their family? I don't know. That's a pretty big question, right? How do we measure those sort of things? I'm not saying they're not empowered, and I'm not saying that they can't be empowered, but I'm just saying if that's one of the pillars in which we recognize and measure empowerment, well, access to information is a pretty big one, and it's a very basic level, not something that's easily available for a lot of women in the developing world. Now, the next pillar of the World Bank sort of guide to empowerment is inclusion and participation. So are women, particularly since we're talking about women this week, are they included and are they able to participate in governance? One of the best places to talk about this is Saudi Arabia, right? Saudi Arabia has a very long history of being known as regressive to women in a lot of different sort of ways. And so this is one area where it's easy to sort of point out inclusion and participation. There are a lot of restrictions on women's rights in Saudi Arabia. Male guardianship is a thing. They have to have a male in their life to allow them to do a lot of different sort of things. Very strict standards around modest dress and other sort of stuff. Lots of restrictions on sports and physical education. It was for a very long time that no woman in Saudi Arabia could drive. It was illegal for women to drive. That's just been updated, and little by little we're seeing more women driving. Lots of sex segregation there. And so for a lot of people, they point to places like Saudi Arabia or other Muslim countries and say, yeah, women aren't equal here. They're not able to be included and participate in governance in a lot of different ways. There's a video I want you to watch this week on Canvas that talks about sort of some of these changes and are they symbolic or are they bigger? And again, I'm not saying right, wrong, or otherwise. I'm just saying this is an area where we say, can Saudi women actually be empowered? If they cannot be included and if they cannot participate in all the areas of life that we want them to, is that something that creates an environment where women can be empowered? If not, well, then does that mean no woman in Saudi Arabia can be empowered or no woman in any sort of Muslim country can be empowered? That's a pretty big sort of statement. And so we have to think about these sort of things. Finally, the last case that I want to talk about is accountability. We've talked about accountability and governmental sort of issues for this class several times. And right now, I want you to think about an issue of women and sexual violence. Sexual violence is arguably one of the biggest issues that women face all over the world, over and over, as a number one sort of source of stress, of bodily autonomy, of a whole bunch of sort of things. Sexual violence is often at the nexus of what happens to make women unsafe and unhealthy in this world. And so there is a video this week that talks about the Gulabi gang, the pink lady gang, talking about how they are fighting back against their government that does not protect women against sexual violence. I've got some statistics in the PowerPoint slides that talk about these sort of things. I want you to watch this video and think about it. Do we just feel good because these women are now banding together and like beating people with sticks? Or is this a bigger sort of issue that we have to start thinking about in terms of, can women in India really be empowered if rape is such a huge scourge sort of in society and sexual violence is a huge issue in society? Can women in India ever be empowered? Also, there's some statistics at the end of that slide that are important to sort of just think about from different sort of cultural perspectives. Okay, so in big picture sort of ways, when we talk about women and empowerment, can we ever truly empower women if we don't have personal autonomy or access? Right? Everywhere in the world, if women are unsafe because of sexual violence, and we know that a lot of women are never going to get justice for that violence, if women can't participate equally in governance, not even here in the United States, we've never had a woman president. Does that mean we can ever actually truly be empowered? If we don't have access, if we don't have information, can we ever really be empowered? If the people who hold the power, which tends to be men, want to stop women from claiming their rights, isn't it totally possible that they can, right? And so can women only be empowered if men let them? Well, does that sound like empowerment? Men letting us be empowered? No, that doesn't really sound empowering. But when it comes down to it, the rights that we have and the gains that we've made, is it because we've finally convinced somebody to, yeah, we should have these sort of things? Those are all tough sort of philosophical questions to think about. How do we empower women then if we say, yes, these things are all possible? How do we empower women to have better health outcomes? How can we, specifically for women living in really disadvantaged situations, whether it be the developing world with lack of information, whether it be lack of safety, whether it be lack of access to government, how can we help women in these situations that live in really maybe highly patriarchal societies actually have an empowered life, right? We want to think that that's possible. We like to think like, yes, women, we hear us roar, but what does that actually look like when we're talking about women who are living in really different sort of situations? Especially if we start asking the hard questions of, are women in the US even really empowered? What, just because I have pink hair, am I empowered? No, when we know the wage gap, or when we know when sort of political power is differentiated in a lot of ways, well, that starts to ask some really hard questions. How do we enact and enforce sort of women's autonomy and rights without doing that in a way that's culturally imperialistic, right? Are we supposed to go into Saudi Arabia and say, you treat your women like poop, and so you're never going to have a good society? Well, what about the women who are like, no, this is just part of our religious and cultural experience? Are we supposed to say like, no, honey, if you want to be empowered, you need to do something different? That's kind of crappy, right? And so we have to think about these sort of things. So one of my questions is empowerment a nice idea? Sort of how human rights is a nice idea. We talked about that last week of like, yeah, we want human rights to be universal, but is it? When we come down to it and we have all these other sort of conflicts, do we see things differently depending on where we're coming from? So is it that empowerment is very much a nice idea, something that we wish could really happen and wish was easy to happen, but maybe like human rights, sometimes it's more of a nice idea than something that actually we can hold on to and take care of? How does this stuff or how does this concepts impact the rest of the work that we have talked about in this class and what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the semester? If women make up 50% of the population and they're not empowered, then what does that mean for the health of nations? What does that mean for global sort of health and these ideas of pushing people forward? So again, as always, I have lots of questions and not very many answers for you. That's just the nature of this class is how do we think about these sort of things? Let's ask the questions that we need to ask. What is sort of true and right and good in this world? We don't really know, right? And so we just have to keep thinking about these sort of things. So next week is spring break. Please be safe. I don't know what your plans entail, if you're traveling, if you're not traveling, COVID, whatever. But please be safe. I want you to come back in one piece, healthy and whole. And it's always my biggest fear over spring break that college students will go and something bad will happen to them. So please come back, be responsible, make good choices. Okay. And I will see you in 2 weeks and we'll start talking about men and how do we empower them? What? Yeah, I know. All right. See ya. Bye.